was quite a time at the farm, telling them about the swarm and how Charles had so cleverly captured it. I was rather surprised when I came out again and he wasn't waiting at the gate. Not unduly so, however. Charles is pretty good at achieving hold-ups. When I got back to the cottage, though, and there was the car still in the drive and no sign of him whatsoever, only a peculiarly brooding silence over the place, I began to feel tottery at the knees. He'd been to look at those bees and got stung, I thought, and now he was lying stretched out starkly in the cottage. He wasn't inside the cottage, so I next imagined him stretched out starkly in the car. He wasn't. I could scarcely bring myself to look in it. There, so he must be lying stretched out over the hedge. I was just, my world in pieces around me, about to go in and get the mosquito net and see if I could possibly drag him out, buried beneath crawling bees, I imagined him, and they'd undoubtedly get me as well, and they wouldn't find either of us for days, when I heard footsteps coming down the valley. It was Charles, unstung, but mad as a hatter. "What have you been doing?" I called with relief. "They got away," he shouted back. "They can't have done," I said, but they had. He'd just been opening the gate, said Charles, when he'd heard this sudden buzzing across the lane. He'd looked across. There they were, all in the air, and before he could do anything, they were away. They'd swooped low across the garden. Charles's later interpretation was that they'd come down to say goodbye to him, but at the time, he'd leapt hastily into the car out of their reach. Away up the valley. By now, Charles was out of the car and running after them. Though the roof of the ruined cottage, he'd thought they were going to settle there, said Charles. But the darned things did a loop round the rafters and then zoomed out again and away up over the hillside and into the forest. We never found that lot either. But next day, Charles got the bee expert over and went down through the hive. There were 3 more queens just ready to hatch, he reported. We'd have lost another 2 swarms if we hadn't called him in. Bees do this, it seems, if the hive is exceptionally prolific. Not just 1 swarm takes off, but up to 4, till the hive is reduced in size. As to why that swarm had got away from Charles, the first swarm, said the expert, had had the old queen at its head. When she came down, she'd wait till the scouts came to lead her to a new home. In our case, she'd waited till next morning, and if we'd captured her, she would have stayed, and so with the rest of the swarm. The subsequent swarms, however, are led by virgin queens, just hatched, said the expert, and flighty and restless, like young maids the whole world over. He'd never known a virgin swarm that did stay put unless you locked them in to hold the queen. So there we were. We were certainly learning about bees. There was more to it than he'd thought, said Charles, considerably chastened. She was still looking forward to tasting our honey, cooed Miss Wellington whenever she saw her. She didn't get any. We didn't even take 12 pounds of it that season. The swarms had carried off most of it when they absconded, and the bees still in the hive would need the rest to feed them through the coming winter. It was the bees still in the hive I was worried about in connection with Seeley. Next year, when they'd built up again and were ready to sting people, it would be a new little cat who was venturing forth. Solomon and Sheba had been grown cats when we had the bees, and they'd met up before with individual ones. How could a little kitten know about a hive? We'd do something about them before the spring, Charles assured me. Put wire netting around them, maybe let someone else have them. They took up a lot more time than he'd thought they would. Come the spring, I thought resignedly, I'd bet he'd get bee fever all over again, and I'd be making bee candy and haring to everybody's rescue. There were months yet to spring, however, and I had more immediate things to worry about, like the question of keeping up with Seeley's appetite and his vanishing into the woods. and the growing signs of depredation around the place. Hope springs eternal in the human breast is undoubtedly the motto of every Siamese cat owner. The cat rip the chair covers, turn carpets into remarkable imitations of Astrakhan, smash china till you'd think they had chairs in a pottery. And still, when the owner replaces the article, he imagines that this time all will be well, with one or two precautions perhaps, like putting rugs over vulnerable furniture, moving china from the route of Siamese steeplechases, and when one catches the culprits at it, ordering them firmly, very sternly, to desist. It never works, of course. Some friends of ours took precautions when they were having some armchairs recovered, to the extent of consulting with the buyer of a large furniture store as to the most suitable Siamese-proof material he could suggest. Now that, he said, being an enthusiast in his profession, would make a really interesting experiment, and one that might help lots of other suffering cat owners. So he provided them with samples of material which they left around, tacked casually onto boards, large boards, said our friends, to simulate the backs of chairs. It was obvious the burnt orange boucle wasn't the answer. That finished up like sacking with holes in it, the same colour too, within days. It was obvious the charcoal tweed wouldn't do either. The colour was all right, but it now had a fur fabric nap. Finally, they settled on a dusky green, tight woven, I suppose you'd call it a linen rep. The cats hadn't so much as looked at that one, said their owners. The buyer said it obviously didn't titillate their claws. They hadn't looked at it, because why the heck should they, surrounded by boucle and tweed and strong claw-making moquette? Once the experimental panels had been taken away, though, and in their place stood 3 chairs resplendent in tight-drawn green linen, it titillated their claws then, all right, said their owners. They'd had the backs out of those chairs within weeks. No, it hadn't been of use to provide them with stropping boards. The green chairs were their mecca, and nothing else. We'd gone through it all ourselves, of course. Goodness knows how many hearth rugs Solomon had ruined, stropping exuberantly in the middle to test his strength, he said. We'd tried putting a car rug down when we were out of the room, but that hadn't been any good. Solomon merely played tunnels under the car rug, and now we couldn't see him, he said excitedly, so we didn't know who was doing it, did we? Stropped harder on the hearth rug middle than ever. There was the hide armchair in the hall, reduced by Sheba to a striking example of shagreen with holes in it. There was Solomon's demolition of the stair carpet and Solomon's morning exercises round the bed. He'd pulled himself up and down the bed base so heartily for years that the stuffing now stuck out in tufts. It was no good trying to stop him doing it either. It made him feel good, he said. Why, after all our experience, we should have, I thought, that Seeley was going to be different. But that was the hope-springing eternal bit. He looked such a harmless little kitten too. One couldn't imagine him doing any damage. We soon learned, it must have been about his second day with us, that having shut him into the hall to try to have our lunch in peace, we decided to let him in because we couldn't stand his yelling any longer. It couldn't be good for him either, said Charles, crying his little heart out like that. So he opened the door, and I was still laughing at the way Seeley shot the length of the room like a greyhound straight from the trap, when he flashed back over my shoulder and landed smack in the middle of my plate. He'd been making for the armchair behind my dining chair as a take-off board for the table. He hadn't been charging up the room at random. Thereafter, he made for that chair whenever he came into the room, either as a quick way onto the table if we were sitting at it, as a ricochet spot, or a smart bit of show-off if we weren't, or to drag himself round on his back when he was bored, all the more so when he discovered that it got me hopping mad. It did make me mad too. The ricochet bit was clever, Seeley dashing into the room, leaping in full flight to hit the back of the chair at a wall of death angle with all 4 feet as he passed, and then galloping on as if in a circus ring, was most spectacular indeed, and always earned a round of applause from his onlookers. But Seeley throwing himself onto his back, clawing his way noisily and deliberately round the bottom of a practically brand new loose cover, and then pausing, still on his back and watching with one canny blue eye round the corner to see what I was going to do about it, made me very mad indeed. So I shouted at him, said he was a horrible little cat, which was just what he was waiting for, and with a look of fiendish glee on his face, he careered on round the bottom of the chair. After that, Seeley, dragging himself along one side of the chair, waiting to be scolded, and then zipping at twice the speed round the back and along the other side, was a regular feature of the cottage day. So was Seeley exercising himself round the bed base, which showed, said Charles consolingly, just how much he was growing to be like Solomon. Not to be left out of things, Sheba now started her own stropping sessions on the dining chairs. It was nice to see her feeling so good, I said, but I did wish she would find somewhere else. It was no good, of course. She'd strop on a chair to attract Seeley's attention. He'd come across to hide beneath it and poke a paw excitedly up at her. She'd poke him back, and he'd start climbing up to get at her. Bang, before my eyes went my tomato-covered chairs. Bang went something else too. Seeley, shut out in the hall at meal times, started in on the draft excluder round the door. He must have decided that if he could winkle that out, he could get in through the resultant crack. So after a few indignant protests, he would sniffle, sit down, and proceed with the task of removing the draft excluder. Yellow foam rubber it was, and scattered in clawed out bits over the red hall carpet. It was not only quite impossible to miss seeing it, but it looked exactly like crumbled sponge cake. What on earth? Demanded Miss Wellington, arriving with a collection box one morning after breakfast and seeing what appeared to be pieces of cake scattered hysterically all over the carpet. Not wanting to go off and tell people I'd been throwing cakes at Charles, I explained the situation in detail, about shutting Seeley out or else he got in the plates, and if we did shut him out, then he set to on the draft excluder. I got no sympathy from Miss Wellington. She'd disapproved strongly of our having Seeley, partly because she'd been so fond of Solomon, and thought having a new kitten so soon meant we'd been hard-hearted over him ourselves, and partly because she thought it would upset Sheba. She'd come in one day, however, and Sheba had been lying in front of the fire with a car rug banked round her as always in winter to keep out the draught from the door. "And how's our little girl?" inquired Miss Wellington, going forward to stroke her. Then she stopped. From where he lay, tucked into Sheba's side with the red tartan rug round the pair of them, a little black pansy face was regarding her. Not quite like Solomon's yet, for his mask was still a smudge, but it was Solomon's eyes that looked up at her before he yawned, stretched, and put a fat little black paw more comfortably across Sheba's neck. "The dear boy," said Miss Wellington, after which you'd think that Seeley had been entirely her own idea. Now she said, "The dear boy," in quite a different manner, as if we had chained him in a dungeon, not merely shut in the hall, so we could eat in peace. And if the dear boy had chewed the draft excluder, her tone implied she only hoped for the sake of our conscientiousness he hadn't swallowed any. He hadn't, or if he had, it didn't hurt him. And if Miss Wellington had had to put up with his yelling, not that we objected to his voice. We delighted to hear it. We could detect a definite note of Solomon in it, and the note was growing. His way of stumping along, saying, "Mer, murr, murr to himself was enchanting too. It was just that sometimes his voice was so overpowering. When he was in the hall, for instance, and roaring his head off to come in, or when we had the woods in prospect and was demanding very raucously to be let out. He sounded like Solomon then, all right, and very much like his own father. Wanna, 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 he would sit and howl with his eyes closed at the kitchen door. He would get quite carried away with the drama of it too, and was always obviously quite surprised at himself when I interrupted him with, "And what do you think you're doing?" "Please," he would plead then beguilingly in his tiniest seagull voice. Chapter 11. That was all very well, but he was becoming more adventurous every day, and when we let him out, we never knew what he was going to get up to. Come to that, we never knew what he was going to get up to if we kept him in either. The first venture onto the table, for instance, when, with a mighty leap from the back of the armchair, he'd landed in my plate, that had given him a taste for taking flying jumps at things, followed by spectacular skids. The skids were no accident either. From the inevitability with which they occurred, it was obvious that they were quite deliberate. He skidded across the table, skidded across the countertops in the kitchen, skidded exuberantly across the bathroom floor like a small boy on a slide. One day, he skidded through the kitchen door and out into the yard so fast that when he tried to turn the corner of the cottage and head for the lawn, he fell flat on his stomach on the paving stones. "Didn't matter," he said, picking himself up and galloping dustily on. He was getting to be an expert at falling down. He was also getting to be an expert at falling off things. Those prodigious leaps didn't always work. Sometimes they landed him on the kitchen counter when there were dishes on it, or the table in the sitting room when there were papers on it, and with a wild scrabble, off would plop Seeley, plus whatever he happened to have got his paws on. He broke so many plates and saucers that against the day when it might occur to him to try for the mantelpiece, I stuck down all the china on that with strips of sticking plaster. Better to be safe than sorry, I thought. I had my grandmother's Staffordshire figures up there. I didn't want to move them, but I didn't want them smashed. Or the Italian china cats, or the glass swan from Venice that Louisa gave me, or the big willow pattern platter that was Charles's grandmother's. So I anchored the lot with sticking plaster. And wouldn't you have bet on it, Seeley never so much as looked at the mantel shelf. Presumably it didn't offer the right possibilities for skidding. But with the inevitability that follows anything I do, as surely as it rains, if I clean the cottage windows, someone comes to tea a few days later who happened to be interested in Staffordshire china. "Ah, we'll watch," she exclaimed, heading for the mantelpiece as soon as she entered and reaching for the yellow-trousered gentleman on the left. Presumably, to air her knowledge, she would then have said, "Ah, Rob Roy," and reached for the dour-looking Highlander on the right. But she didn't get that far. There was a slight sound of tearing as the plaster lifted a bit, but anchored fore and aft by 5 pieces of elastoplast, Will Watch stayed exactly where he was. Her eyes widened as she looked at what was holding him, and at the strips on the china cats and on the glass Venetian swan. She was nothing if not urban, however. "Ah, Benard's vases," she said to bridge the uncomfortable pause, having sighted the big brass ewers at either end of the mantelpiece. They weren't held down by elastoplast. They hadn't been properly cleaned either. Rushed for time as usual, I'd polished the fronts and handles before she came, bung them back on the shelf, confident that they gleamed like gilt in front and that nobody could possibly see the backs. She did. She lifted them down, turned them round to examine the pattern, and I could have sunk through the floor when their unpolished reverses came into view. It was all his fault, I informed Seeley when she'd gone. and Seeley sat there as usual, looking back at me innocently. He always did look innocent. We kept his toys, his ping-pong balls and his catnip mouse and the fur spider with a bell on it, of which he was especially fond, in a china mug on the table by the wall. A cider mug, two-handled and very old. Not stuck down because it hadn't occurred to me that it was necessary on an out-of-the-way table by the wall. He looked as innocent as a Botticelli angel when, in the course of fishing out his spider, he managed to land the mug with a crash in the middle of the coal scuttle. All those years and Solomon had never done that, I wailed, rushing as I anticipated to pick up the pieces. All those years, and he'd never done that either, commented Charles, as I retrieved the mug. And to my amazement, it was still in one piece. Solomon would infallibly have had the handles off, and Seeley sat peering over the table edge, the picture of wide-eyed wonder. Must have been Sheba, he said. He looked innocent when we found him locked unaccountably in the woodshed too. At least, it would have been unaccountable, except that I happened to be in the yard and saw him disappearing behind the shed with a purposeful look to his rear view, and knowing that his next move could well be round the corner up onto the hillside, I nipped smartly after him to see where he was going. I was just in time to see him vanish through a hole in the back of the shed, a hole which filled, as the woodshed is, with bottles, baskets and Charles's odd bits and pieces we didn't even know was there. Seeley did, and when the next moment the wails of an imprisoned Siamese, absolutely in dire distress, send for the vet at once and better get the police as well, when the old familiar call that we knew so well from Solomon rent the air and Charles came running as usual with a look of apprehension on his face, we would have been flummoxed too, that we had to undo a padlock to get him out, except that I had seen him going in through the back. There he was when Charles unlocked the door, posed more angelically than ever on a pile of old wood shavings. How on earth did you get in there? Demanded Charles, who hadn't yet heard the story. He didn't know. Somebody pushed him in. Must have been Sheba, Celia assured him soulfully. So he proceeded through the winter, happily playing the game of Locked in the Woodshed by Sheba, exploring the mysteries of the countryside, entwining himself in our lives with every day that passed. Secretly, I dreaded the thought of Christmas that year. Aunt Ethel and Louisa and Charles's family there, everything as it always had been, except for a dusky-faced cat no longer with us. I thought of Solomon a lot on Christmas Day. It was better than I'd anticipated, however. Annabelle was there on the frosty lawn eating her biscuits and carrots. Sheba was with us on her tomato-coloured chair, her paws tucked under her like a little sitting hen, squawking complacently when people spoke to her. And if my eyes wandered sometimes around the chattering lamp-lit room, to where a cat with big bat ears had once watched us from under the table, to where a cat with a worried expression had once peered from under a chair, to where a cat, when he decided the visitors were safe, had once sat holding Christmas court majestically on the hearthrug. Now, in the self-same places, frolicked a little fat white kitten, hiding beneath the table, peering from behind the chair, venturing forth when he was sure that all was well to play with his tail before the fire. The wheel had turned full circle. Seeley was carrying the lamp. He not only carried it, he singed his whiskers on it. The bathroom at the cottage is on the ground floor, built back into the hill. In damp weather, it condenses badly, and to combat this, we keep an oil lamp burning behind the bath. An old-fashioned Aladdin table lamp, which just fits into the narrow space against the wall. Turned low for safety, it gives very little light, but the heat is sufficient to warm the wall It smells not of oil, but of old-time country warmth, and such light as it does give affords a mellow, mysterious dimness. So it seemed, thought Seeley, who, when he asked to be let through the sitting-room door these nights, could be found not seated worriedly on the coal bowl, as had been his initial wont, but sitting quietly on the mosaic surround of the bar. Thinking, he said, when we asked him what he was doing. Charles said he supposed it was all right to leave him with the lamb. Of course it was, I said. Solomon and Sheba had never touched it. It was therefore my fault, indubitably, that Seeley returned one night without his whiskers. The lamp, not meditation, had been the attraction, until at length, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, he plucked up courage to look down into the lamp chimney, and zip, as fast as lightning, he'd lost his whiskers. Just like Solomon, said Sheba when she saw him. It was too, except that Solomon's whiskers had been chewed off affectionately by his mother, not singed off over a lamp. Growing more like him every day, said Charles with apprehension. Growing he was indeed. When we first had him, he could hide under the armchairs, dart around like a clockwork mouse beneath the bed, streak through the bars of the gate in the yard like an arrow as he made for the hillside. Now, he could only poke a paw beneath the chairs when he lost his spider under them. He got stuck quite regularly, yelling his head off under the bed, and he could only just squeeze through the bars of the gate. One day, in fact, I spotted him making his exit through the gate as usual, rushed to retrieve him before he could get into the lane, and discovered to my alarm that I couldn't get him back. He could obviously squeeze onwards, sliding in the direction of his fur, but he was wedged so tightly otherwise, there was no question of pulling him back. To let him slip through, on the other hand, meant one victorious swoosh and a game of Seeley at large in the woods. So we opened the gate with Seeley still in it, I holding him suspended, while Charles nipped quickly through and pulled from the other side. And Father Adams, who was passing by as usual, said, "Another couple of feet, I reckon, and thee'st have to saw him out." It was quite true. Seeley was growing, and he was going to be a very big cat. Already when they were lying down, it was difficult to tell him from Sheba, but a lot of Seeley's weight was due to his appetite. Charles said he thought he ate even more than Solomon. He couldn't do, I said, remembering Solomon in his heyday. Such a long time since Solomon was a kitten. You must have forgotten his capacity. All I know, said Charles with firm conviction, is that Solomon didn't eat his food before he got it. That was true too. Seeley, when he sighted food, would head for it with his tongue already working in and out in anticipation, holding back while Sheba ate, and you could see him gulping in sympathy. And then, as he watched her, out would come his own tongue. Seeley was eating too, in imagination. When it came to eating in practice, his appetite knew no bounds. He would eat his own food, polish off any bits Sheba happened to have left, and then look around for more. He would quest the kitchen, nose to floor, like an otter exploring new territory. We had seen the Ring of Bright Water film, and the resemblance was really remarkable. It came, perhaps, this zest for food, from being brought up with so many other cats. Eat it quick and decide what it was later, was probably Mum's advice to her young. That, no doubt, was why I found him in the sink one day, sampling the washing up water. And that, no doubt, was why I found him on another occasion, one day when we had visitors. The cooking preparations had been hectic, and as usual, the kitchen was a welter of pans and dishes, standing on the cooker, his back feet parked in a bowl with an inch of cream in it, while he ecstatically licked the gravy from the grill pan I'd put in the window. Not, I should explain, that he didn't also like cream. Presumably, standing in it staked his claim to it, while he dealt as fast as possible with the gravy. No wonder he was growing, though. From the size of his feet, he was going to be a lot bigger yet. His whiskers were emerging where he'd singed them too. I could scarcely believe it. They were growing out like Solomon's, spotted. He was 5 months old exactly now, and it was almost time for him to be neutered. Around 6 months was the best time we knew. I rang to make the appointment. "You're sure it is a male?" the vet inquired. I said there was no doubt about it. No doubt about it indeed. "Fine pair of tonsils he's got, hasn't he?" said Father Adams admiringly one day. Unfortunately, in the presence of poor Miss Wellington. Miss Wellington, shocked to her very foundations, still turned scarlet when she thought about it. So there we were, with neutering day coming up, and just then we had some visitors. The 2 school teacher sisters who, in the dark days when we'd lost Solomon, had phoned us with the telephone number that led to Seeley. For weeks we'd been saying they must come and see him. And first there'd been a cat flu scare in the district and we hadn't dared get together. And then it had been Christmas and all of us so busy. Now it was a new year and over they came to see him. He was absolutely on his best behaviour, telling them his life history after he'd decided they hadn't come to kidnap him, rolling on the hearthrug for them, sitting on their laps. We'd never known our Seeley so attentive. The sisters had Siamese themselves, twin Seal Point females called Sugar and Spice. Any Siamese owner will recognise it as inevitable as dawn follows dusk, that if one of those cats was going down with something, it would be when it or its owners had been in contact with another Siamese. Sure enough, the very next evening, one of the sisters rang up in a panic. Spice was ill, she said. They'd called the vet. They'd heard that cat flu was going round in their village. We'd better watch Seeley for symptoms. They'd never forgive themselves if he was ill, she said. But truly, Spice had been positively bounding the previous day. And that's where I'm going to leave it.